On April 30th, 1945, beneath the shattered center of Berlin, the war above ground has become almost impossible to recognize. Soviet artillery shakes the concrete of the Reich Chancellery. Dust filters through the bunker corridors. Telephone lines are failing. Messages arrive late or not at all. And outside, Red Army soldiers are fighting their way through streets only a few hundred meters from the seat of Nazi power. Yet underground, the machinery of government is still being made to function. Inside Hitler's bunker, there are still telephones, maps, clerks, guards, and orders. There's still a chain of command. But the country those orders are supposed to control is collapsing around them. Hitler has spent his final days refusing to leave Berlin. His armies are retreating or destroyed, his capital is encircled, and the men around him are beginning to calculate what comes after him. Then, on this final day, the man whose decisions had shaped Germany for 12 years disappears behind a closed door. For those still underground, there is no longer any realistic path to victory. There is only one question left. What happens when the center of the Third Reich itself ceases to exist? The bunker had never been designed to become the final headquarters of a collapsing state. It was a command complex beneath the Reich Chancellery, protected by thick concrete and buried beneath Berlin. Its purpose was survival from bombs and the continuation of government during air raids. But by April 1945, the underground rooms had become something very different, a sealed world beneath a city being destroyed above it. The strategic situation was beyond repair. On April 16th, the Soviet offensive towards Berlin had begun. Within days, Soviet forces had broken through the German defenses and encircled the capital. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops met at Torgau on the Elbe, demonstrating how completely Germany had been cut apart. In Berlin, however, the fighting continued with extraordinary intensity. Hitler's problem was not simply that he lacked soldiers. It was that the military system around him had ceased to function as a coherent whole. Units were fragmented. Communications were unreliable. Reinforcements existed largely on paper. Some formations were fighting street by street, while others were attempting to escape the encirclement. And still the bunker produced orders. Martin Bormann remained beside Hitler, controlling access to him and helping manage the increasingly narrow political machinery around the dictator. Joseph Goebbels arrived with his family on April 22nd and remained committed to Hitler until the end. Other officials came and went, carrying messages between the bunker and whatever remained of the German state. Even the succession of power became part of this final underground drama. On April 23rd, Hermann Göring sent Hitler a message asking whether he should assume leadership if Hitler became incapable of governing. Hitler interpreted the move as betrayal and stripped Göring of his offices. Then came another shock. Heinrich Himmler had attempted to make contact with the Western Allies. Hitler responded by ordering his arrest and expelling him from the Nazi leadership. The regime was collapsing from the outside in, but also from the inside out. On the night of 28 to 29 April, Hitler married Eva Braun inside the bunker. Bormann and Goebbels acted as witnesses. Shortly afterwards, Hitler dictated his personal and political testament. He removed Göring and Himmler from his political legacy and appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor as head of state. Goebbels was designated Reich Chancellery. It was an extraordinary administrative ritual at the edge of annihilation. A government was being appointed for a country that was already being conquered. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable, true stories like this to the channel. But the bunker was not merely a place where decisions were made. It was also a place where people waited for the inevitable. Above them, Soviet forces were closing in. The sounds filtering underground were becoming more immediate. Artillery, small arms fire, explosions, and the constant vibration of a city under assault. Inside, staff members continued their routines as far as circumstances allowed. Some carried messages. Others handled telephones and documents. Guards maintained security. The ordinary mechanics of bureaucracy survived astonishingly close to physical destruction. Then, on April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun died by suicide in the bunker. Soviet forces were approaching the Reich Chancellery, and Hitler had chosen death rather than capture. The atmosphere inside the bunker changed immediately. Hitler's death did not produce a clean transfer of power. Instead, there was uncertainty. News had to be communicated. Orders had to be transmitted. The surviving leadership had to decide what could still be achieved and, increasingly, how to escape Berlin. Compared with the enormous command structures of Germany's earlier years, the final government was painfully small. The machinery that had once directed armies across Europe had been reduced to a handful of exhausted officials operating from underground rooms, while Soviet troops fought through the capital. The contrast with the Allies was stark. In London, Washington, and Moscow, governments possessed functioning communications networks, secure territory, and vast administrative resources. Germany's final leadership had almost none of these advantages. The comparison with Germany's own earlier command system was even more revealing. In 1941, German forces had invaded the Soviet Union across a front thousands of kilometers wide. By April 1945, the leadership was struggling to communicate with formations fighting within Berlin itself. What had once been an expansive military command had contracted into a bunker. Yet the bunker did not immediately disappear. Goebbels, now nominally Reich Chancellor, refused to leave Berlin. On May 1st, he and his wife Magda had their 6 children killed with cyanide before both parents died by suicide. Bormann attempted to escape after Hitler's death, seeking to reach the new government being formed under Dönitz. His fate remained uncertain for decades. He was tried and sentenced to death in absentia at Nuremberg, while Soviet-era evidence and later forensic examination eventually established that he had died in Berlin in 1945. The bunker itself became a symbol almost immediately. Soviet forces entered the Reich Chancellery complex and investigated the remains. The physical site was later destroyed and altered, and the original bunker complex no longer survives in its wartime form. But photographs, documents, testimony, and archaeological evidence have preserved an unusually detailed record of those final days. The historical significance, however, lies less in the concrete than in what happened inside it. The bunker did not cause Germany's defeat. The collapse had been developing for years through military losses, economic strain, strategic overreach, and the destruction unleashed by Nazi Germany across Europe. By spring 1945, Allied armies had entered Germany from the west, while Soviet forces advanced from the east. The final Soviet offensive encircled Berlin, and the German state was approaching unconditional surrender. What the bunker represented was the final concentration of a political system that had once dominated much of Europe. For 12 years, Hitler's government had projected an image of absolute control. Orders traveled outward from Berlin. Ministries, party offices, police organizations, and military headquarters transformed those orders into action. But in the final days, the direction reversed. Information flowed into the bunker, telling its occupants how little control remained. And still they issued orders. That is perhaps the most revealing feature of the final hours. The concrete could stop bombs. It could provide shelter. It could preserve telephones, maps, and documents. But it could not restore the armies that had been destroyed, reopen roads that had been cut, or reverse the advance of the Red Army. On the morning of April 30th, the bunker was still functioning. By the afternoon, Hitler was dead. On May 1st, Goebbels was dead. The following days brought the final collapse of Berlin, and on May 7th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender to the Western Allies at Reims. A second surrender ceremony followed in Berlin on 8 to 9 May. The last orders had not saved Germany. They had merely revealed how completely the state had ceased to control events. Return to that bunker beneath Berlin, and the scene becomes almost unbearably small. Concrete walls, failing telephones, maps marked with movements that no longer corresponded to reality. Men and women waiting for messages from a world that was disappearing above them. For Hitler, the bunker became the place where his rule ended. For Goebbels, it became the final stage of a commitment to a regime that had brought catastrophe to Germany and immense suffering across Europe. For Bormann and the others, it became a place from which survival itself became uncertain. But beyond those walls, history was already moving on. Berlin would fall. The Nazi state would disappear. Its crimes would be documented, investigated, and prosecuted. At Nuremberg, many of the surviving leaders would face judgment, while Hitler, Goebbels, and others could not be tried because they had taken their own lives. The bunker, therefore, was not the scene of Germany's final victory, nor the command center of some last strategic miracle. It was something far more revealing. It was the place where a dictatorship that had demanded absolute obedience finally confronted the limits of its own power. Above ground, soldiers were still fighting. Below ground, orders were still being written. But neither could change what was coming. The last orders of Nazi Germany were given in rooms where the outside world had already passed beyond their reach. And that is the final lesson of the bunker. Power can build walls, issue commands, and demand obedience, but cannot command history itself.